Chapter 2 The Pool of Tears. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. "Look at me. Now I'm growing like the largest telescope there ever was. Goodbye, feet." For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight. They were getting so far off. "Oh, my poor little feet. I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears. I'm sure I shan't be able. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best way you can. But I must be kind to them," thought Alice, "or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see. I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas." And she went on planning to herself how she would manage it. They must go by the carrier, she thought, and how funny it'll seem, sending presents to one's own feet, and how odd the directions will look. Alice's right foot, hearthrug near the fender, with all of Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking. Just then, her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the golden little key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look through into the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "A great girl like you, to go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you." But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep and reaching halfway down the hall. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry, muttering to himself, "Oh, the Queen! The Queen! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask anyone for help. So when the rabbit came near, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit was so startled, he dropped the white gloves and fan and scurried away into the darkness as quickly as he could. Alice grabbed the fan and the gloves and, as the hall was very hot, kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking. "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today. And yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night. Let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Now that's a great puzzle." And she began thinking over all the children she knew that were the same age as herself, to see if she could have been changed into any of them. She tried to remember her lessons and said, "How doth the little—" and she crossed her hands on her lap as if she were actually saying her lessons and began to repeat it. But her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come as they used to do. "How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcome little fishes in, with gently smiling jaws." "Now wait, I'm sure those are not the right words," said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. "I must be stupid after all. I might be Mabel. I shall have to go and live in her tiny little house and have no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. It'll be no use putting their heads down and saying, 'Come up again, dear.' I shall only look up and say to them, 'Who am I then? Tell me first, and then if I like being that person, I might come up. If not, I'll stay down here and tell somebody else. But, oh "Oh dear," cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears. "I do wish they would put their heads down. I'm so very tired of being all alone here." As she said this, she looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white gloves while she was talking. "How could I have done this?" she thought. "I must be growing small again." She got up and went to the table to measure herself, and found, as nearly as she could guess, that she was now only 2 feet high and going on shrieking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether. "That was a narrow escape," said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. "And now for that garden." And she ran with all speed back to the little door, but alas, the little door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. "And things are worse than ever," she thought, "for I never was so small as this before, and I declare that this is not good." As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash, she was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea, and in that case I can go back by railway, she said to herself. Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that wherever you go on the English coast, you'll find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of locking houses, and behind them a railway station. However, she soon made out that she was in the pool of tears which she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "Oh, now I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, as she swam about. She tried to find her way. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. Now that'll be a strange thing, to be sure. Everything is so strange today." Just then, she heard something splashing about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first, she thought it must be a walrus or a hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made out that it was only a mouse, and that it had slipped in just like herself. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak to this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here, and I should think very likely that it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So she began. "Oh, mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I'm very tired of swimming here." Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse, but she had never done such a thing before, though she remembered having seen in her brother's Latin grammar, "A mouse, of a mouse, to a mouse, for a mouse, oh mouse." The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. "Perhaps it doesn't understand English," thought Alice. "I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror." For, with all of her knowledge of history, Alice had no very clear notion how long ago anything had happened in history. So she began again, "Où est mon chat?" which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you didn't like cats." "No, not like cats," cried the mouse. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "But don't be angry about it. And yet, I wish I could show you our cat Dinah. I think you'd fancy cats if you could only see her. She's such a dear, quiet thing. Alice went on, half to herself, as she swam lazily about in the pool. And Dinah will sit purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face. And she is such a nice soft thing to pet. And she is such a capital one for catching mice. Oh, I beg your pardon, cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. We won't talk about her any more, if you'd rather not. We indeed, cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of his tail, as if I would talk about such a subject. Our family always hated cats. Nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear that name again. Oh, I won't indeed, said Alice in a great hurry to change the subject of conversation. Are you fond of dogs? The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. There is such a nice little dog near our house. I would love to show you. He's a bright-eyed terrier with such long curly brown hair, and he'll fetch things when you throw them, and he'll sit up and beg for his dinner and all sorts of things. And he belongs to this farmer, you know, and he says his dog is so useful, he's worth 100 pounds. He says the dog kills all of the rats and, oh dear, cried Alice, I'm afraid I've offended you again, for the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as he could go, and he made quite a commotion in the pool. She called softly after him, Mouse dear, please come back again. We won't talk about cats or dogs if you don't like them. When the mouse heard this, he turned around and swam slowly back to her. His face was quite pale, with passion, Alice thought, and he said to her in a low, trembling voice, Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is that I hate cats and dogs. It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with the birds and animals that had fallen in. There was a duck, and a dodo, and a lory, and an eaglet, and many other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore.